Kansas Territory, July of 1872. The wheat had grown high that summer, gold and swaying under a heavy sun. It was near dusk when Holden Prescott spotted the strange shape in the field, a slump of pale blue fabric, unnaturally still. He pulled his horse to a stop, squinting. There was something else, too. A soft sound, a baby's cry. Holden dismounted fast, boots thudding into dry dirt. His rifle stayed slung across his back. He had a sick feeling this was not a trap, but something worse. He pushed through the stalks and came upon her, a woman. Collapsed in the grain, her arms curled protectively around a tiny infant at her breast. Her dress was torn, dust-stained, and stuck to her with sweat. Her eyes were half-closed, lips cracked, cheeks flushed with heat. The child, no more than a few weeks old, was suckling weakly. "Miss," Holden dropped to his knees, pulling the canteen from his belt. "Can you hear me?" She stirred slightly, barely lifting her head. Her voice was a rasp. "Water." He eased the canteen to her mouth, tilting it gently. She drank in slow, shaking swallows. Her fingers trembled around the baby's back. "You're all right now," he said quietly. "I got you. You're all right." The woman passed out before he could say more. She woke in his wagon, shaded under canvas, the baby still cradled against her chest. The slow rocking told her they were moving. Holden glanced back from the driver's seat. "You're awake." She blinked at him, lips moving before sound came. "Where?" "About 4 miles from where I found you, heading to my place. Nearest town's too far and you need rest." She tried to sit up, winced, and fell back. "My baby." "He's fine," Holden said. "Fed and quiet, strong lungs though. Name?" "Evelyn," she whispered. "Evelyn Vale. This is Elias." Holden nodded once. "Name's Holden Prescott. I've got a cabin west of here. It's quiet. You can stay as long as you need." She stared at him, eyes dull with exhaustion. "Why are you helping me?" Holden shrugged. "Because you needed it." His cabin was small but clean. One room with a cot in the corner, a table, a stove, and shelves lined with jars of dried food. He carried her inside himself, careful not to jostle the baby. She was light, too light. "Reckon you haven't eaten in days," he said as he set her down gently on the cot. "I walked 3 days," she said softly, eyes following him. "From a farm near Waverly. It belonged to my husband's cousin. He left when he found out I was with child." Holden turned from the stove, his brow furrowed. "He abandoned you?" Evelyn nodded once, then looked down at her baby. "I had nowhere else to go." Holden didn't ask anything more. He set a bowl of warm beans and cornbread beside her, then stepped outside to give her space. She watched him go, her eyes lingering on the way he walked, steady, quiet, strong. That night, Elias slept in a drawer Holden had padded with a wool blanket. Evelyn ate everything he set in front of her, and then, still weak, she slept again. Holden sat by the fire, watching the shadows on the wall. He was not used to company. Not since his brother died out in Colorado and the war before that. But something about the way Evelyn had curled around that baby in the wheat field, it stayed in his mind. He had not planned for this, but he was not the kind of man who could ride past a woman dying in the dirt. By the 3rd day, Evelyn could stand on her own. She moved slow, but determined. She insisted on washing her own clothes, and she helped prepare the meals with trembling hands. "You do not have to do all this," Holden told her, watching as she chopped potatoes. "I do," she said. "I will not be a burden." "You are not." She looked up at him then. Her eyes were still tired, but there was something else there too, something warmer. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded, then turned back to splitting wood. The heat blooming in his chest was unfamiliar. He had not felt much in a long time. The days passed quietly. Evelyn grew stronger. Elias smiled in his sleep now. She would sit in the shade with the baby while Holden worked the land or fixed the fence. He built a cradle from scrap pine, sanding it smooth with the edge of his knife. When he brought it inside, she touched it gently, her eyes wet. "You made this?" she asked. He nodded. Figured the drawer was not a long-term solution. Her hand brushed his as she leaned down to settle Elias inside. Neither of them moved for a moment. "Holden," she said gently, "why are you alone out here?" He hesitated, then said, "I came back from the war and there was nothing left for me in Missouri. My folks were gone. I had a little money, so I bought land here, thought I would live quiet." She nodded. "You have?" He looked at her. "Do you want to leave?" She did not answer right away. Then, "I thought I would, but now, I do not know." That night when Elias cried, it was Holden who got up first. He rocked the baby by the fire until Evelyn woke and found them there. She stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching him with something like wonder. He looked up at her and his voice was quiet. "He likes the sound of the fire, calms him." She stepped closer. "You are good with him." "I never thought I would be," he said. "But he is easy to care for." Her eyes met his. "We are not easy, Holden." He shook his head. "You are not trouble." "That is not what I meant." He looked down at the baby again, then back at her. "I know." She stood there for a long time, and he did not look away. The fire crackled between them, but the silence was full, not empty. The next afternoon she came up behind him in the field, barefoot in the grass. "You found me out here," she said. He turned. "Yes." "I was dying," he nodded. "You saved me." Holden stepped closer. "I could not have ridden past you, Evelyn." She looked up at him, her voice trembling. "You never left." "No," he said. "I never will." When she kissed him, it was soft and certain. Her hand touched his cheek, and he wrapped his arms around her like she was something too precious to lose. Elias stirred in the cradle nearby, but did not wake. The wheat swayed around them in the wind, same as the day he found her. Only now she stood on her own 2 feet, and he had no intention of letting her go. The light changed in August. The heat softened, and in the evenings the wind carried the scent of turning earth. Evelyn stood at the edge of the garden Holden had coaxed from the dry Kansas soil, her shawl drawn close against her shoulders. Elias slept wrapped against her chest, his breath warm through the cloth. Holden was mending the gate, sleeves rolled past his elbows, hands steady with the wooden hinge. She watched the way he worked, not just with skill but with care, like the place mattered, like it had become more than just a patch of land to outlive the world. "Did you plant the lilacs?" she asked, her voice quiet enough to let the dusk settle between them. He looked up from the latch, then toward the modest bush near the cabin wall. "They were here when I came, barely hanging on. I dug them deeper, gave them a windbreak. They're blooming again," she said. He stood and dusted his hands on his trousers. "Took 2 years." She shifted her weight and touched the baby's back. "I don't know how long I'll need to stay." Holden leaned back against the fence post, watching her from beneath the brim of his hat. "You don't owe me time or a decision." "I know," she said, then paused. "But I think about what comes next for him, for me." He nodded once. "You think about leaving, I think about where I'd go," she said. "Who I'd be there." He didn't speak right away. A pair of meadowlarks trilled in the distance, and Elias stirred lightly, then settled. "I've never asked more of you than what you were willing to give," he said finally. "And I won't start now." Evelyn's fingers brushed over the baby's hair. "I don't want to be afraid of wanting something again." Holden's voice came low. "Then don't be." Inside the cabin, supper waited, already cooling. She didn't move just yet. He didn't either. "I used to write letters," she said. "Before everything, I had a journal once, just pages stitched with thread. I'd write what I hoped for, what I was afraid of." He stepped closer, slow and easy. "What did you hope for?" "I hoped I'd be loved without having to ask for it." Holden's hand rested on the fence rail between them. "And now," Evelyn looked up, eyes steady, Now I want to stop running from the parts of me that still believe it's possible. The wind shifted. Holden didn't reach for her, but he didn't look away either. Then I'll stay right here until you believe it fully. Later that night, after Elias was laid in his cradle and the fire burned low, Evelyn stepped outside again. The sky stretched wide with stars, and in the stillness, she heard the soft creak of wood from the barn. She found Holden inside, seated near the tack wall, oiling the worn leather of a saddle. He glanced up, but didn't speak. "I used to think silence meant someone was angry," she said. "That if they weren't speaking, they were waiting to leave." He rubbed a slow circle into the leather. "Out here, silence is just another kind of company." Evelyn stepped over the threshold and leaned against the post. "I'm starting to feel safe when it's quiet. That's how I know you're healing." She watched him finish the seam, the oil darkening under his hand. "Do you ever miss Missouri?" A long pause followed before he answered. "Not Missouri. Just the parts of me I lost before I got here." She looked toward the open barn door, the wheat field silver under moonlight. "Maybe this is where I start remembering mine." Holden set the saddle aside and stood. "If you do, you won't be doing it alone." She didn't move when he came closer, didn't flinch when he lifted a hand to tuck a strand of her hair behind her ear. His fingers paused at her jaw, calloused and warm. "I'd like to stay," she whispered. His hand dropped gently to her back. "Then stay." She leaned into him, not because she was tired, but because it felt right. The barn was quiet except for the distant sound of crickets and the thrum of a place that had waited long for something to grow again. And Evelyn, standing there with Holden's hand steady on her spine, knew she'd stopped running. By early September, the mornings came with a cool bite in the air. Evelyn wrapped Elias in a quilt stitched from old shirts Holden had found tucked in a trunk under the cot. The colors faded but soft against the baby's skin. She moved slower, but not from weakness anymore. It was the kind of quiet rhythm that came when a person no longer feared the next hour. Holden was out by the creek with a bucket and a bar of lye soap, scrubbing the grit from his hands after repairing the ox yoke. When she came down the slope with Elias in her arms, he turned his head at the sound of her boots pressing into the damp grass. "You always wash up the same way," she said, stopping by the edge of a flat rock. "Elbows first, then knuckles, then the rest." He glanced at his hands, the water beading and rolling down his forearms. "Habit. You had someone teach you that, my brother," he said. "Said you had to treat your hands like tools if you wanted them to last." Evelyn shifted Elias as he began to stir. "What was his name, James?" She waited, but Holden didn't say more. Instead, he reached for his shirt, slung over a low branch, and pulled it on slowly. "I used to braid my sister's hair," Evelyn said, watching the creek move clear and shallow. "She had a birthmark behind her left ear, like a thumbprint." Holden studied her face, his brow drawn slightly. "She's still living?" "No," Evelyn said, voice even. "She caught fever the year I turned 12. I still remember the way her laugh sounded through a closed door." Holden didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, "You've got the kind of memory that holds tight to what matters." She looked at him. "Do you?" "I remember things I didn't think I would," he said. "The way my father's boots sounded on the porch, the way James used to whistle through his teeth when he was thinking." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I forget sometimes that you had a life before this land." "I don't," he said. "It's what brought me here." Elias gave a soft grunt and began to fuss. Evelyn shifted him again, patting gently. Holden reached over and dipped his hand in the creek, then ran his damp fingers across the baby's forehead. "You ever think about having more?" he asked, voice low. She glanced at him, startled. "More children?" He nodded, watching her closely. "I don't know," she said after a moment. "I didn't think I'd raise even one, and then I did." Holden's voice stayed quiet. "You're good with him." "I'm learning," she said. Every day. He looked down at the baby who had quieted again. I'd build another room if you needed it. Evelyn blinked. You would, Holden nodded. Cabin's got the bones for it, just needs time and the right wood. That's not what I meant. I know, he said. But I'd still build it. Later, after Elias had gone down for a nap and the midday sun stretched across the floorboards, Evelyn sat at the table with a pair of trousers in her lap, patching the knee with a square of old canvas. Holden came in with a sack of dried beans over his shoulder, and when he set it down, she didn't look up. You have a steady way of being quiet, she said. It doesn't press, it just fills the space. Holden pulled a chair out and sat across from her. Not sure what else quiet's supposed to do. I used to fear it, she said. Now I find myself waiting for it. He reached for the tin cup on the table and took a slow sip. I never wanted to be a man who filled silence with noise. Evelyn tied off the thread and snipped it. I never thought I'd feel safe with a man again. That held in the air between them. She didn't rush the moment, and neither did he. I've been thinking, she said finally, setting the trousers aside. If I stayed, I want to do more than just live here. Holden's gaze didn't shift. What would you want? I'd want to make something of the place. A garden that feeds us past one season, a coop for hens, maybe a goat. He leaned forward, forearms braced on the table. You'd have all of it. I don't want it given to me, she said. I want to build it with someone. Holden's eyes didn't leave hers. Then build it with me. She held his gaze for a long time, then nodded slowly. All right. He reached across the table, palm up. She placed her hand in his, her fingers curling naturally into the warmth of his skin. Outside, the wind scattered dry leaves across the porch. Inside, no one spoke, but something settled, something rooted. They began gathering stones the next morning for the foundation of the new room. Not because the cabin needed it just yet, but because they both understood what it meant to start building something that would last. The first frost came early that year, whitening the split rail fence and curling the edges of the late lettuce Evelyn had planted. Holden rose before dawn to cover the seedlings with burlap sacks, his breath visible in the lantern glow. Inside, Evelyn dressed Elias in wool, wrapping his legs before lifting him onto her hip. She'd let the fire burn low overnight, and the cabin held the chill in its bones. I'll heat water, she said, stepping out of the bedroom corner. We'll need it for washing. Holden hung his coat on the peg by the door. I'll bring in more kindling. He didn't kiss her cheek or take the boy from her arms. They didn't need to. They moved around each other with the intimacy of people who'd learned one another by feel what weight each could carry. What silences meant comfort instead of distance. That evening, Evelyn sat on the floor beside the hearth, shelling dried peas into a tin bowl while Elias dozed in his cradle. Holden was carving notches into the edge of a long plank measuring for the bed frame they'd agreed to build together. She watched the careful angle of his knife and the furrow in his brow. You ever think about teaching? She asked, not lifting her gaze from the peas. Teaching, he echoed. Boys. Young ones, you've got a way of showing things without crowding. He brushed the wood shavings into a pile with the side of his hand. Never thought I had much worth passing on. You do, she said, and not just your hands. Holden looked from the plank to her. You think I could make something of that? I think you already are. He set the wood aside and leaned back in the chair. What about you? Evelyn slid the bowl to the side. I want to write again. Not stories, not yet, but maybe letters. To women who have had to start over. He ran his thumb along the edge of the plank. Not many get to, I know, she said. That's why I want to try. Holden nodded slowly. You'd need paper. I've been saving the blank sides of those old ledgers you brought down from the loft. He smiled, faint and quiet. You think ahead. I have to, she said. It's how I made it this far. Later, when Elias fussed in his sleep, Holden lifted him, cradling the boy against his shoulder. Evelyn watched from the table, her fingers curled around the rim of the teacup she'd steeped from dried mint and blackberry leaves. "He'll know what steady feels like," she said softly. Holden rocked with a slow rhythm. "He'll know what love looks like." They didn't speak more that night, choosing instead to let the warmth of the room and the sound of wind against the shutters carry what words couldn't. By the third week of frost, the soil had hardened. The ground wouldn't take another seed until spring. Evelyn began sewing curtains from a muslin sack she found in the storage chest, humming softly as she worked. Holden built shelves above the stove, and they filled them together jars of beans, dried fruit, a tin of coffee she'd traded for with their last eggs. One morning, Holden found her at the creek, her skirts damp at the hem, her hands trailing through the water. "You all right?" he asked. She looked up at him, eyes clear. "I'm thinking of planting bulbs before the ground freezes." He stepped closer. "You think they'll survive?" "Maybe not," she said. "But if they do, they'll bloom when the snow's gone." Holden looked at the sky where the clouds hung low and pale. "Tell me what you need." She reached into her basket and pulled out a wrapped cloth. "Just your help." They planted together that afternoon onions, garlic, and the last of the daffodil bulbs from her mother's garden. Elias slept in a sling against Holden's chest, his tiny breath steady against the wool of his coat. As the sun lowered, casting long shadows across the hard earth, Evelyn leaned against him, her gloved hand slipping into his. "I never had a man plant flowers with me," she said. "I never had a reason to," he answered. She laughed, soft and real. "We're making something here, Holden." "I know," he said. She turned toward him, her expression quiet but sure. "Do you want to be my husband?" Holden didn't hesitate. "Yes." They married at the edge of the field 2 days later, with the wheat stubble dry underfoot and the last of the geese overhead. She wore the dress she'd mended with her own hands. He wore his father's watch on a chain tucked beneath his collar. The vows were spoken steady and plain, and when they kissed, it was with the certainty of people who had already chosen each other long before the words were said. No one stood with them but Elias, nestled in a basket beside the lilac bush. And it was enough. They had made something whole. The wind moved through the empty stalks, and the cold did not bite so sharply that day. By the time the snow reached their doorstep, Evelyn had stitched Elias a hooded cloak from a wool coat Holden no longer wore. The baby had grown, his legs stronger, his hands always reaching for something Holden's suspenders, the kettle handle, the edge of Evelyn's sleeve when she leaned close. He was learning the world through touch, and she let him, as long as it was safe. Holden had begun rising later, no longer needing to walk the long perimeter each morning. The fence posts held, the livestock were settled, and the cabin now with its second room finished stood firm against the wind. They had built it all with their own hands, and it bore their marks in the scuffs on the floor, the smoke-darkened beams, the shelves Evelyn insisted on sanding herself. One evening, after Elias had fallen asleep on a quilt of his own making, Holden turned the old ledger pages she had saved for letters. She'd written to 2 women so far, one in Abilene, another near Osage City, both widowed, both raising children alone. Evelyn didn't ask for anything in return. She simply told them what it had meant to survive and what it meant now to live. She stood in the doorway, drying her hands on a towel, watching him read the page she'd left open. "They wrote back," she said, folding the towel. "The one in Osage City said she planted onions for the first time because of what I told her." Holden looked up. "That matter to you?" "It does," she said, "because I remember when it didn't seem like anything I did could matter." He folded the page neatly and set it aside. You've made more of this place than I ever planned to. You gave me the stillness to try." They sat by the fire, not out of need but habit. Holden tugged his chair closer and reached for her hand. She gave it without hesitation. "You ever think we'd end up like this?" he asked. Evelyn smiled faintly. "I didn't think I'd end up at all." Holden's thumb brushed the back of her hand. "There's a softness now in you, not weakness, just ease." "I stopped bracing for everything to fall apart," she said. "I think that's what love does when it's real." He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, "You've given me a home without me asking for one." "I know," she said. "You've done the same." Snow fell heavy that night, blanketing the sloped roof and the split wood stacked beneath the awning. Evelyn rose early the next morning and found Holden already dressed, kneeling by the hearth with a pot of oats warming. Elias sat nearby, bundled and chewing on a wooden spoon. "I was thinking," Holden said, stirring the pot. "Spring comes, we could take the wagon east, maybe as far as Lawrence. See the river. Let the boy touch something bigger than this patch of land." Evelyn set down the basin she carried. "You'd leave the cabin for a bit," he said. "Not because I need to, because I want to show him the world's wide. And I want you to see it with me." She stepped to him and reached for his shoulder. "I'd like that." They spent the winter with quiet purpose. Evelyn taught Elias how to hold a spoon steadier. Holden taught her how to use the crosscut saw without catching the edge. They talked of planting cabbage next season, of digging a second well closer to the barn, of carving a bench for the porch so they could sit outside when the thaw came. And when the snow began to melt in March, they gathered seeds in little muslin sacks and labeled each one in pencil. Evelyn's handwriting was finer now, more certain. She wrote the names of each plant as if she already believed in their roots. The day they packed the wagon to head east, Evelyn stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked back once. The shutters were open, the rooms swept, the cradle empty but waiting. Holden stood beside her with Elias in his arms, the boy gripping his father's collar. "We'll come back," she said. Holden nodded. "It'll all still be here." They rode out together, the wagon slow but steady over thawing ground, the wheels creaking beneath the weight of what they'd built together and inside themselves. They reached the river after 2 days of travel, and Evelyn stood barefoot at the edge, holding Elias close as the boy laughed at the sound of rushing water. Holden came to stand behind her, his hand resting gently at her waist. "It's wide," she said. He nodded. "But it doesn't scare me." "Me neither." They didn't talk about what came next. They didn't need to. They would return to the cabin, plant their seeds, raise their son. They would write letters and build fences and wake beside each other without dread. Every day would be ordinary. And that, at last, was the miracle. Their love, born of grief and grit, had taken root in the quiet, and it would hold, through frost and heat, through time and the soft hush of years passing gently. They had already endured the long dark. What remained now was the sun rising, warm and steady, on a life they had made with their own hands, and they would live it all together.